Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Impact Forum 2021. When we are faced with a big and urgent challenge like ending homelessness in the United Kingdom, sometimes it pays to take a step or two back. It pays to reflect, and it pays to learn from history. At a week-long series of events at the year's Impact Forum, we will hear from experts about the changes we must make to end homelessness for good. We will consider and debate the challenge as a whole, as well as break it down into different elements that may need their own solutions. After all, it can seem like a mighty task, but challenges can be overcome. Goals can be completed, however mighty they may appear. History shows, whether through dramatic reductions in smoking, alcohol-related traffic fatalities, or deaths from malaria, that bold goals seem impossible until they aren't. Today, for the opening session of our Impact Forum, I want us to look to history. I want us to consider a task that at the time appeared so mighty that it must have seemed impossible. That challenge was the rebuilding of Germany from the ruins of the Second World War. But Germany did it. Germany emerged from a disastrous defeat to become the most prosperous country in Europe, with its economy and industry admired across the globe. And one quality more than any other was required of the German people to achieve this: resilience, which is the theme of this year's Impact Forum. So I'm delighted to welcome as our first speaker, Sir Richard Evans, one of Britain's foremost modern historians. He is an expert on modern Germany and the author of 20 books, including The Pursuit of Power, Europe 1815 to 1915, and a 3-volume history of the Third Reich. Sir Richard was Regius Professor of History at University of Cambridge and President of Cambridge's Wolfson College, and is currently Provost of Gresham College in London. But before I hand over to Sir Richard, I want to remind you all that we welcome your questions and comments. Do feel free to introduce yourself to us and the other attendees in the comment box. For any questions that come up as the session goes on, please post them into the Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen, and I will put them to Sir Richard to answer later in the session. The hashtag for the forum is Impact Forum 2021, so please get involved in the conversation on social media too. Sir Richard, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Just one small correction. I've retired a few months ago as Provost of Gresham College in London. Otherwise, that was a very generous and kind introduction. And of course, I was delighted and surprised to receive an invitation from Greg Hurst to talk to this conference about meeting challenges through collective resilience from the point of view of an historian. Apart from anything else, it's encouraging to know that it's not just historians who think we can learn from history. As Ligia said, my own field of expertise is a history of modern Germany, a country we know today as prosperous, stable, and democratic. But in the course of the 20th century, Germany went through long periods of crisis, upheaval, and disaster. First World War, the hyperinflation of the early 20s, the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression in the early 30s, with over 35% of the workforce unemployed, leading to the false solution of the Nazi period when economic recovery and full employment were only achieved by rearmament on a massive scale, leading to, of course, World War II. And that war led to the end of the Third Reich and the total defeat of Nazism, Hitler's suicide, and the occupation of Germany by the Allied powers, Britain, America, and France, and the Soviet Union. So the question I want to ask and try briefly to answer today is, what challenges did Germans face at the end of the war, and how did they overcome them? Few countries have ever been in a state of such total devastation as Germany in May 1945, when the Second World War in Europe came to an end. And few countries have ever been in such a terrible state. Millions of German soldiers were in prisoner of war camps. Many of those held by the Russians did not return until the mid-1950s. Germany's towns and cities had mostly been reduced to rubble by the air raids mounted with increasing frequency by Britain and the USA from 1943 onwards. Around 500,000 civilians were killed in the bombing raids in Germany. 40% of the housing stock in German towns and cities with more than 20,000 inhabitants was reduced to rubble. In some large cities, notably Hamburg, the second largest city in Germany after Berlin, this figure was as high as 70%. Capital city Berlin itself had been hit by repeated large-scale raids. Some smaller towns suffered even more. The loss of housing stock in the town of Paderborn, for example, reaching a staggering 96%. As a consequence, people fled the towns for the countryside in huge numbers, joining the hundreds of thousands already evacuated there. The people who remained in the cities, basic services like gas, electricity, and water supplies became irregular in the last months of the Third Reich and then were cut off for days on end. Of course, bombing raids having destroyed the supply centers. Food rations were reduced sharply in the last months of the war till it became very difficult to find enough to live off. Roads and bridges smashed, telephone lines down, postal service non-existence, communications almost completely destroyed. 90% of German railway lines were unusable. And to add to the chaos, there were about 8 million foreign workers in Germany, drafted in forcibly by the Nazi authorities to make good the loss of manpower and suffered in the conflict. More than 700,000 prisoners in Nazi concentration camps in early 1945. And as the Red Army advanced, more than 14 million ethnic Germans fled before it from countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, and so on, or expelled by the inhabitants who'd suffered under Nazi rule or the rule of Nazi collaborators, both at this time and through 1945 to 6. Nearly 1.75 million of the refugees and expellees died or were killed en route. German industry was hit by the Allied bombing raids, and at the end of 1945, industrial production stood at 20% of the level of 1936. And on top of this, of course, the complete obliteration of the country's communication networks made obtaining raw materials and shipping out products to markets almost impossible. Well, thinking about resilience, despite the massive destruction at the final phase of the war, the Germans kept on fighting to the end, but not because they were all fanatical Nazis. Partly this reflected the massive terror unleashed by the government, the Nazi government, as the situation got worse. 16,000 German soldiers were executed by military courts in the course of the war for defeatism, desertion, and similar offenses, compared with 48 in World War I. Civilians who criticized the regime, tried to do a deal with the Allied troops as they approached the town gates, were publicly hanged from lampposts or shot on the street. More importantly, though, I think Germans kept on fighting because of a basic sense of patriotism, because they're rightly afraid of the Red Army, whose advance on Berlin was accompanied by mass shootings, theft on a gigantic scale, and many kinds of atrocity, including the rape of at least 1 million German women. Many Germans continued to believe in the possibility of a turnaround of the country's military forces, trumpeted by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda apparatus for the government, achieved by miracle weapons like the V2 rocket, although that turned out to be something of a damp squib. And not a few Germans had such faith in Hitler that they refused to believe he could be defeated. And when the end finally came on the 8th of May, 1945, the Allies were in the occupation of the whole of Germany. Unlike the situation earlier in the war, when countries like France had been occupied by the Germans, there was no resistance. Hitler was dead. His leading lieutenants had either committed suicide, like Goebbels, a bit later Goering, Himmler, hundreds of Nazi ministers, generals, and officials, or were in Allied custody. Tiny number escaped, but that wasn't anything to weigh the balance against the hundreds and thousands of leading Nazis who were dead or in prison. Germany's defeat was total, unlike in 1918. Cities were reduced to rubble. Almost everyone could see Nazism had led to disaster. Almost everyone, in any case, was too preoccupied with staying alive to bother with politics or mount any kind of resistance. So the first task facing Germans was to clear out the mess the Nazis had left behind. Dead bodies lying everywhere in the cities had to be disposed of. The rubble strewn over the streets had to be cleared away. Dangerous and damaged buildings had to be made safe. Women, the vast majority of the population, after millions of men have been killed or were still in Allied captivity, took the lead. The term Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, quickly became current, seen everywhere in Germany's towns and cities in the spring and summer of 1945. Removing 13.5 million cubic tons of rubble from the central area of Cologne, for example, took well over a year. Restoring bridges and railway lines took even longer. Local administrations took time to rebuild gasworks and power stations, repair pipes and lines. All took a long time. The whole process was still going on in 1946. So, too, was the repatriation of millions of so-called displaced persons, 7 or 8 million foreign workers in Germany. In the last months of the Third Reich, food supplies become scarce, weekly rations cut to bare minimum. And through 1945, rationing continued, now supervised by the Allies. In later years, questioned in the 1980s, Germans who lived in the industrial area of the Ruhr remembered the entire period from 1943, the turning point of the war, with Stalingrad and the bombing of Hamburg, to 1948 as a single unbroken period of disaster, deprivation, disease, dearth, and death. From the point of view of ordinary people trying to stay alive, the end of the Nazi regime really made no difference. The average daily food rations were limited to 1,200 calories, far less than was needed to live off. So that was the quantity of food you could buy per day legitimately. And so a massive black market sprang up, even before the end of the war, run by armed gangs who in some places like Cologne engaged in actual shootouts with the Gestapo. The Allies didn't do a lot to help. The top military official in the US zone wrote in June 1945, he said, I feel the Germans should suffer from hunger and cold, as I believe such suffering is necessary to make them realize the consequences of a war which they caused. People were reduced to scavenging for food and rubbish heaps. Many lived in cellars or makeshift shelters or ruins. Thefts of coal from railway yards rocketed. Grocery shops were stormed and looted. One official estimated that 80% of Germans only survived by using the black market, and most farmers wouldn't sell their produce in any other way. Also, in 1945, all the structures of organizational life suddenly disappeared, leaving individuals to fend for themselves. Political and social organizations only very gradually began to re-emerge, most important being the churches. Struggle survival, however, was conducted mainly on an individual basis. Even families have been broken up by the loss of a husband or father, or by the evacuation of the children to the countryside, or by flight or expulsion. It was almost impossible to reconstruct a stable home life, not least because of the mass destruction of housing. German industry took a long while to recover, but crucially, only around 17% of German industry had been destroyed in the war because many factories had been relocated to the countryside. The Allies began dismantling factories and plants and took machinery, railway equipment, rolling stock for themselves in lieu of war reparations. All of this led to widespread malnutrition and disease in 1945-6 in Germany. Overcrowding, the lack of decent dwellings encouraged disease. Difficulty of finding functioning washing and toilet facilities and clean running water encouraged dirt and disease. Death rates increased dramatically. The British government conceded privately that death rates among German adults in the second half of 1945 were running up 4 times their 1939 level. Among children, the rate was 10 times higher. Infant mortality was twice as high as the European average in 1946 and 1947. So how did the Germans escape from this catastrophic situation and achieve a prosperous and stable life for themselves? The first factor in recovery was a changed policy by the Allies. As the Cold War gathered pace in 1946 and particularly 1947, the Western Allies worried that poverty, malnutrition, poor living conditions, unemployment, low wages would turn Germans towards communism. And so the Allies began to import food supplies and pouring vast sums of money into Western European economies, including Germany, through the Marshall Plan from 1948 onwards. course, the Marshall Plan was made conditional on the acceptance of representative democratic institutions, condition rejected by the East. So this is a big dividing line. But the West German economy was pumped up, not least by the Marshall Plan. Industrial dismantling was limited and then stopped. Most German industry reoriented with a lot of difficulty and over many months from wartime to peacetime production. So instead of tanks, lorries, and so on. Heavy industrial production benefited from a world booming demand for steel and similar products. And the economy was beginning to recover fast in the late 1940s. And a crucial step here was taken by the currency reform, creating the German mark across the three Western zones, replacing the old currency, which had largely lost its value, and eliminating the black market as price controls and rationing of goods came to an end. The social market economy was born, bringing a free market into being, but limiting its uneven distributed effects by welfare state measures that cushioned its impact on the poorest. By 1949, the rubble had been cleared away, largely an effort of ordinary people, and as I said, particularly women. Regional and local governments had been reconstructed. State administrations could begin the work of reconstruction. Temporary accommodation overcrowding now had to be replaced by permanent new or rebuilt dwellings. The creation of the West German Federal Republic, paralleled by the East German Democratic Republic in the former Soviet zone, allowed reconstruction to be undertaken on a national basis. Of course, one problem was the absorption of 12 million or so refugees and expellees from the East into West German society. But reconstruction helped them find jobs and boost demand. With so much of Germany's housing stock destroyed, there were refugees and expellees looking for somewhere to live as well. The federal government in Bonn gave generous tax breaks for housing construction. In 1949, some 200,000 new dwellings were constructed, nearly 70% of them being social housing, in other words, built and rented by the state. In 1950, this figure rose to 340,000. In 1955, 540,000 new dwellings were constructed. The overwhelming majority of Germans lived and live in rented accommodation. It's not a home-owning society. It's a bit more than it used to be, but it's still living in a rented flat is the norm, and that in many ways made things easier. Reconstruction in the broadest sense, of course, depended heavily on the work of German professionals, lawyers, doctors, architects, industrialists, financiers, teachers, professors, scientists, and the like, who'd been heavily involved in the Nazi regime and the trials at Nuremberg of the major war criminals, and thousands of trials of lesser perpetrators in Dachau and many other centers, both in Germany and in occupied countries like Poland and France, was an enormous effort, but it still left the great majority of old Nazis untouched. This denazification program was largely produced so-called fellow travelers as people rushed to exonerate their friends from accusations of involvement in the regime. In the Third Reich, of course, it was impossible to pursue a professional career without belonging to the Nazi Party. The Allied occupation authorities had little choice but to make use of their expertise if reconstruction was to be successful. It left a lot of questions unresolved as Germans succumbed after 1945 to kind of collective amnesia that lasted at least till the end of the 60s. And that, in a sense, is the price that had to be paid. The crimes of Nazism tackled to some degree, but by no means complete. And many old Nazis left to live their own lives without fear of being brought to justice. That was the price paid for reconstruction. So what lessons can we learn from all this? Well, it seems obvious that the massive social and economic problems faced in 1945 in Germany for some time afterwards could only be solved in part by ordinary people coming together, rebuilding, reconstructing, getting things going on an enormous scale. Most of it, I think, was due to the intervention of the state. German state institutions were not allowed to re-emerge in 1945, and the Allied occupying powers focused on punishing the Germans. And that did force ordinary citizens back on their own resources. So they knuckled down, forgot about politics, forgot about the past, and focused on rebuilding things. And of course, the destruction of family life and the difficulties of collective action in the immediate post-war period was a further problem. The only kind of collective institutions in existence since 1933, apart from the church, in other words, for 12 years or more, had been top-down dictatorial Nazi institutions. People had to learn to fend themselves. The black market was one way in which people showed resilience in a situation where officially sanctioned food supplies were completely inadequate. But in the longer term, this made things more difficult. And it was, I think, above all, martial aid and the recreation of German state institutions, especially then pushing through the currency reform in the West, that allowed Germany's famous economic miracle to be launched. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sir Richard. So you've talked about Germany's experience in the 1940s, but Germany also underwent great upheaval between the First and Second World Wars. Can you tell us perhaps about one episode from this period, the homelessness movement led by Gregor Gog?
Yes, well, of course, vagrancy, homelessness, people wandering around the countryside, either begging or doing odd jobs, is a major feature of pre-industrial Europe. You think of the villages, people coming around, tinkers, gypsies, Sinti and Roma, people selling things, wandering, and also workers. It was a central part of pre-industrial labor that you had so-called journeymen who travel around joining the guilds in whatever and doing their apprenticeships, whatever town they went to. And that was still in existence in pre-industrial parts of Europe, including large chunks of Germany in the early 20th century. So in a way, kind of vagrancy is not people looking for a home, it's people who think they don't need one. And what happened in the 1920s, where, of course, their numbers were swollen by unemployment, by the economic crisis of inflation and so on, is that radical artists and radical thinkers, anarchists, for example, Tolstoyans, all kinds of people living alternative lifestyles, got very interested in this. And one of them, a former sailor called Gregor Gog, actually organized the vagrants and had a national meeting at which several hundred of them actually turned up. And a lot of artists turned up. It's in Stuttgart in 1929, and painted and drew. And there's quite a rich kind of artistic record of this, what was seen as an alternative lifestyle. So this is very different from people who were living their life in houses and basically wanted to continue doing so, but being deprived of it by the destruction of the housing stock during the war and the subsequent economic problems. But it's an interesting example of how vagrants, wanderers, people who are homeless, at least in part by choice, organize themselves and try to provide institutions, support institutions for wanderers, so men's homes, women's homes, homes for vagrants, various kind of soup kitchens, all of this kind of thing. But it's a very different world to the post-Second World War world.
And what happened to the movement when the Nazis took over?
Well, I'm afraid Gregor Gog was arrested by the Gestapo and put in a concentration camp, died in 1945. The whole movement was closed down by the Nazis, who called vagrants the so-called work-shy. People were unemployed. After a while, they weren't drafted into the army in 1935. They were called asocial, was the Nazi term for them. And once Germany had achieved full employment by 1937 or 8, through rearmament, arms factories, steel factories, and so on, they were arrested and they were put into concentration camps. You know, and the concentration camps had different kind of triangles, different colors sewn to people's uniforms. So they were given their own special colored triangle, and essentially the Nazis regarded them as surplus to requirements, as inferior in some way, and a substantial number of them were killed. So it was an extremely bad end to this movement.
And so, Richard, as you know, the theme of this year's Impact Forum is resilience. So we're especially interested in the lessons from 1940s Germany about national resilience and social solidarity during a crisis. What can people working on social challenges, such as ending homelessness, learn from Germany's experiences, you think? And do similar lessons emerge from 1940s Britain about national resilience?
Yes, well, I think this is a really good question. So if you look back to Germany 1945, you see people, and as I mentioned in my talk, especially women, because you have millions of men, 5.5 million men have been killed in the war, and there's many millions more in Allied captivity. So they simply knuckled down and got to it, even without being organized. The organization obviously helps. But what can you do if you're living in a bombed out house? You've got to get yourself some shelter. You've got to find some tarpaulins or build something. And very quickly, I think people began to come together to just face these horrendous problems. The black market, of course, was governed by gangs who were, in many ways, could be quite violent, and there's certainly a lot of extortion going on. But on the other hand, the number of people who depended on the black market, I said about 80%, got together and tried to make it work. So there are many ways in which people help themselves. And ultimately, as I said, I think it's the state that comes in. Now, the damage in Britain in 1945 wasn't nearly so bad. I don't want to trivialize it, of course. There was the Blitz in London. And I remember my mother telling me about it, and pretty horrendous. Right through the night, it's like daytime with all the blazes and the fires and so on. A lot of stock was destroyed, but it's not on the scale of Germany. And also, more importantly, the Britain, the regime, the British political system, British political parties, Conservative and Labour, survived. In Germany, you have the whole structure of institutions is completely destroyed and has to be built from the beginning upwards, except for, as I said, the church. Whereas in Britain, you've got the Labour Party, and people, I think, by and large, felt that they needed to have a new start. They'd gone through 5 years or more of war, conflict, sacrifice, and they needed to build a better Britain. And I think that was a very important factor in the election of the Labour government in 1945, which then, of course, enormously strengthened the welfare state and set up, as we know, the National Health Service. And of course, then continued by the Tories, began a housing program. Harold Macmillan, who became Prime Minister in the 50s, was housing minister when Conservatives took over from Labour at the beginning of the 50s, and he pushed through an extremely ambitious housing program. So the political parties are a major help in Britain, whereas in Germany, they didn't really emerge until the late 1940s, in particular with the formation of a new German state in the 1940s. So people in Germany were thrown back much more on their own resources, I think. It didn't have the power of a political party to help them.
And another of the things I find especially fascinating about the legacy of the war is how German cities traumatized in the Second World War show distinct psychological resilience today. And in fact, data seems to show that those German cities that suffered the most are also the ones that show most resilience today. And we see similar patterns in the UK, despite all the differences you highlighted, that even during the bombings, production apparently seemed to increase in the areas that were most heavily bombed. So what are we to learn from that, you think, Sir Richard?
Well, you have to remember that, of course, it took a very long time for German cities to rebuild. One of the worst affected was Dresden, which was the subject of a massive Allied bombing raid on the 13th of February 1945. So only a few months before the end of the war, and they were still rebuilding the major Baroque structures in this wonderful 17th, 18th century city only 20 years ago. So it does take a very long time. I think, of course, the worse things are in terms of housing stock, rubble, ruins, and so on, the more determined people are, and the more they have to kind of roll up their shirt sleeves and get going on rebuilding. And I think that does generate a certain kind of spirit. If things get really too bad, then I think that's can be deeply demoralizing. So there's some level at which people will respond to a desperate situation. But if it gets too desperate, I think that it gets sort of beyond rescue. Fortunately, that didn't happen in Germany. And as I said, for various reasons, only 17% of the German industrial capacity was damaged. So that gave a kind of basis for recovery.
And I suppose that's one of the challenges we have today. It's clear how the pandemic really, was something that steered people into action, and governments at local, at national level, and the sector more broadly rose to that challenge. But how do we make sure that we, I suppose, instill that same level of energy when we don't have a pandemic happening, and how do we build resilience when a pandemic's been going for over a year now as well? It's one of the things that we were confronted with just now.
Well, the pandemic is not a war. So we are not at war with the virus. And what I found really interesting is that if you look at Britain in the Second World War, you can see that people really want to build a new world afterwards. They want things to change because they've made the sacrifices and so on. But now I think people want to get back to normal. They want to get back as far as possible to the lives they were leading before the pandemic struck. Of course, it is going to make changes. I think this kind of communication is through Zoom and webinars and so on is going to be much more important after the pandemic. It may be that people will change their behavior to some extent after the pandemic. We may find ourselves wearing masks for much longer than we thought we were going to. It remains to be seen, but it's not the same kind of thing at all. And by and large, I think with some exceptions, people have behaved in this country reasonably sensibly. Of course, there are some people who dismiss the idea of the pandemic or object to a vaccination program, but they're basically very fringe elements. So I think on the whole, British society has responded with admirable calmness, coolness, and as it were, following the advice of the medical experts.
Indeed. And Germany, being a federal country, obviously has a great deal of power held by each of its states. And the UK, on the other hand, has a more centralized system.
Yeah.
Recent developments. So do you think the federal system in Germany helps tackle complex problems like homelessness, or do you think it might make it more complicated?
Well, both really. So I think, on the big picture, you've got the federal government coming in 1945, but by then an awful lot of the reconstruction has been, it's 49 it comes in the autumn. Germany becomes this West Germany becomes a federal republic, and East Germany goes along a similar way. Before that, there were the regional governments, the Länder as they're called, and they'd been in existence for a couple of years before 1949. It does make a difference when you have a national leadership, and we've seen this in the current pandemic, where you have a national leadership that tries to deny the epidemic or touts quack remedies, like in the USA under Donald Trump or Brazil with Bolsonaro, then disaster follows. So it is important. But also, I think local and regional authorities have a very important role to play. They know what's going on the local level. One size fits all is not the best way to combat a pandemic. We have a federal system to a degree during the current pandemic, with Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland pursuing their own different paths from England. But I think Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, is right, and that if you know the local conditions, you can respond more effectively in some ways.
Yes, indeed, and it's what you need to respond effectively to local conditions. That it's an ongoing debate as well. But on a slightly different point, you've been closely associated with several universities and colleges, and university towns and cities, as you probably know, can experience higher levels of homelessness. How do you observe this, and can university towns like Cambridge think in new ways to help end homelessness?
Yes, I mean, I've taught in Oxford, Stirling, Norwich, and London, and Cambridge. So I've had quite a broad experience. And there is a surprising degree of homelessness in Cambridge. You think of it as a kind of wealthy, high-tech university city. And it's true, of course, there's a very large number of professionals and the students and so on. But there is a homelessness problem. And of course, there are agencies working in Cambridge to combat that. I think the university, of course, is aware of it. There's always a kind of town and gown divide. But I think it's, of course, there are people in social work departments and who grapple with and involved with the problem.
And one of the things that I suppose is noticeable when you look across the Atlantic is that universities in the US are much better at collecting data from students themselves about their housing situation. I wonder whether this is something that you feel universities over here could perhaps start thinking about, because we often may not be aware of students actually being in difficulties or coming from families in difficulties.
Well, here's where what you might call devolution works very well, at least in Oxford and Cambridge, where the students all belong to colleges, which are quite small institutions. I mean, there's 31 of them in 31 colleges in Cambridge. Each of them has between sort of 400 and 1,000 students. So, and there's a very elaborate tutorial system where there's quite a close supervision of the students. So, and particularly in a situation where universities like Cambridge or Oxford are very, very keen to have students from disadvantaged backgrounds coming. That's I think a major concern. I think in other universities, big universities in large cities, the relationship is much more remote, and it's, I think that's where the improvement could come. So I can speak from personal experience here, because my older son went to Oxford, and my younger son went to a university which I won't mention, but is in a big city and is a very good, very, very good university. But my older son had constant supervision and help from the tutorial team in his college, whereas my younger son was left very much to his own devices. I mean, they both did okay, but I think my younger son could have had a better experience.
And one of the things that's also very interesting, I guess, about developments in the UK is that universities doing research on homelessness in particular tend to be few and far between. A lot of work happens in Scotland, Wales, in the northeast of England, less so in Oxbridge and those types of universities. What would you say to, I suppose, young students entering those universities, thinking about how they might deploy their talents, and encourage them to also consider homelessness as a potential interest?
I guess I'd encourage them to join voluntary associations. If you can't find if you're interested in dealing with major social problems, quite a few, of course, in the elite universities will go into politics, but join a voluntary association that deals with homelessness. There are plenty of them. There's your centre for starters. So perhaps you can encourage them to get in touch with you.
Thank you, absolutely. And now let's ask a few questions from the audience as well. So we have a question here that says, after the immediate rebuilding phase, with martial aid, how important was effective domestic leadership, federal and or local, in the next phase of recovery? And maybe, you know, breaking that down, because that's quite a big question as well.
Well, I think after 1945, all European countries that had suffered from the war, including Britain, placed and had bomb damage of the cities, placed housing, rebuilding housing construction at the center of their domestic policy. It was probably the most important thing. Get the economy going again, transition from war to peace production, but above all, find somewhere for people to live and build them. And I mentioned Harold Macmillan's very successful housing program in the 1950s in this country, and that's certainly true in West and East Germany too.
Yeah, and another question is about one of the points you've made during your talk, you know, about how fascinating so many German professionals who had been Nazis went to rebuild after the war, and collective amnesia was used to fudge this. Would you say that confronting the past honestly is incredibly important, or is sometimes for a period at least too raw?
Yes, this is a very vexed and hotly disputed subject, and many people, including many historians, think that there should have been a bigger and better effort to apprehend and bring to justice Nazi criminals in the post-war period. The operation to do that was surprisingly widespread, large, and in many ways successful. And the most successful thing, of course, was that whatever their views were, very quickly, people in Germany came to realize that Nazism had been a disaster, and that includes vast majority of ordinary Nazis. Nobody tried to rebuild the Nazi party apart from a tiny group of fringe extremists after the war, and they were soon banned. So in a sense, denazification was successful to the extent that there wasn't a new Nazi movement and people didn't. But you know, bringing people to justice, that really began to, in a small way, at the end of the 1950s. And then there was the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of camp guards in 1964-5. And then the effort really began to gather strength. And that was one of the things that led to the events of 1968, the student rebellion and so on, because their parents had kept quiet about it all. So that effort confronting the Nazi Party, the Nazi past, the crimes of Nazism, which are on a gigantic, horrendous scale, that is continuing even today. I think it's, in a way, if you look at it historically, in the late 1940s, people in a way didn't have much of a choice because they just had to rebuild their lives. But also there was the impact of the Allies' reluctance to pursue the Nazi war criminals after the first couple of years, because they thought that would demoralize West Germans in the face of what they saw as the communist threat from the East in the Cold War. So there's a kind of combination of circumstances that led to this collective amnesia, encouraged in the end by the Allied occupation authorities from 1947 or 8 onwards.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And there's the next question kind of builds on this, and it asks about whether the perception of the problem across society as a whole, whether it might have had an impact, I guess, on some of what some of the things that happened. So it seems the problem was so widespread in Germany that this itself was a foundation for solidarity and resilience, because it was obvious that everyone was clearly in it together.
Yeah.
There was some tolerance in terms of how to deal with some of those, thorny issues.
Yes. What can I do but agree with you?
Yeah. And on the point, and this is the next question from Ben Fowler, on the point about how Germany reinvented their politics and institutions while in the UK there's been more consistency. What have been the long-term consequences of this in the UK? How might we foster systemic and structural political change in the UK without the distraction that comes with losing a war?
Yeah, I mean, of course, in Germany, people thought, what can we change so that Nazism doesn't happen again? What can we do to strengthen democracy? Ultimately, it was the economic miracle that proved to Germans that you can have a democracy that's economically effective and delivers prosperity. In the Weimar Republic, you did not have that, because the Weimar Republic, Germany's first full democracy, there was a huge hyperinflation in the early 20s, then a massive depression at the end, and it only delivered economic misery. So the economic boom is an enormously important factor. Also, Germany is the country in Europe which is most evenly divided by religious affiliation between Protestants and Catholics. And so there was a Protestant Conservative Party and a Catholic Conservative Party before 1933. And so in 1945, the leading politicians in these parties decided to merge and create the Christian Democrats, because they felt that had been a weakness. And indeed, the Christian Democrats have ruled Germany for most of the decades since then. I think and Germany kind of goes back to the political system before the Nazis, before 1933, but with that major change. Otherwise, you have the Social Democrats, who were the big left-wing party before 1933. The communists have disappeared. So that's another big change. And of course, the Greens are now extremely powerful in Germany. They're in many state governments, and there's certainly a chance they may lead a national coalition government after the upcoming elections. In Britain, it's rather similar. It's not the same political system as it was some years ago. So the first big change is the demise of the Liberal Party, effectively to become a small fringe party in the 1920s, and you're left with two big parties, the Conservatives and Labour, and that's now changed again. So whereas the two-party system subsisted for several decades, now you have the Scot Nats, who effectively control Scotland, have eliminated Labour. You have a constantly evolving situation in Northern Ireland, with constant changes in the political setup. You've got the Welsh nationalists who are becoming more popular. So and today's Conservative Party barely resembles the Conservative Party of the post-war years. So I think there are changes in place. I think what Britain needs, however, structurally and constitutionally, is more devolution. As I said before, I think it is excessively centralized. There's too much power in Whitehall and Westminster, and we need to look much more to the regions. And that, of course, happened with devolution, but the great majority of people in Britain live in England. And I think we now need to go back and revisit the issue of English devolution, which was essentially rejected in the 90s.
And thinking about how that might link with grassroots movements, community resilience. Again, one of the things that seems to be common across the experiences in Germany and the UK are some of the factors that seem to enhance resilience. So things like social connection, more purpose, also greater equality during those periods, and sometimes, you know, also having a sense of humor. What would you say, you know, as we start wrapping up, we can do in the field of homelessness and related fields to continue to learn from history, and in particular things we draw from moments like this, historical moments?
Well, I think one of the things we need to do is to restore power to local authorities in this country. Their budgets have been overwhelmingly, massively cut in recent years by a succession of Conservative governments. And we really do need to go back and put some money back into local authorities. They're the people who are there on the ground. They know what's going on. They can provide support for homelessness. But we've seen local authority institutions closing carts, reducing their staff and so on. It's been quite a disaster, I think. So that's one lesson we need to learn.
And this is one of the most interesting challenges, I guess, we have in homelessness in UK. It's what's the right balance between learning from the body of knowledge we've accumulated over the last few decades, and what's the right level of advice and guidance from the centre versus ensuring that local areas are able to respond quickly to the population needs that they have as well. And do they have the data and evidence and the expertise required and capacity to tackle those challenges promptly as well, for sure. And just one final reflection. Someone is asking, Christine Mears, are there any universities in the UK that are doing robust research around homelessness that you can point us to? If not, which have the best or most relevant research on housing in general happening that could help inform the homelessness sector? Oh, Kristen, there are many great universities and academics doing fantastic work. At the moment, obviously, most of the evidence there is tends to be qualitative, and you just need to look at our evidence tools to see that. But universities like Heriot-Watt, Cardiff, Glasgow, there's many, Sheffield, Hallam, many universities doing fantastic work, but we need more. We need more youngsters, young academics, learning how to do robust evaluation, as well as continuing to develop a rich understanding of the homelessness problem as well. And on that note, Sir Richard, I don't know if you'd like to say a few words about how students, prospective academics, how they might want to contribute to this cause.
Well, I'd say get in touch with you for starters. And then you'll be able to steer them in the right direction, I think. But thank you very much for inviting me. It's been absolutely fascinating.
And thank you, Sir Richard. We're approaching the end of the session, but it's been a very rich discussion that, of course, we hope to continue another time. There is no doubt that ending homelessness for good will require unified action on an unprecedented scale. To do it, the field will need to call upon its collective resilience to face down many urgent challenges. We heard this morning that societies that build resilience do not hide behind a wall of happy talk or try to minimize the challenges. Resilience does not come from mindless optimism. Resilience is built when people confront challenges realistically, with humility, and cooperate to solve them together. As we start to emerge from a global pandemic that affected every aspect of daily life and erased any sense of normality, this year's Impact Forum will explore innovative and evidence-led solutions that aim to build a better future for all, creating opportunities to become more resilient and closer to each other along the way. Thank you again, Sir Richard, for helping us kick off the forum, and thank you all of you who made the time to join us and contribute to the discussion. Next up, you can listen to the incredible David Duke of Street Soccer Scotland at 11 a.m. And then this afternoon from 1:15 to Muff Potts from Camaradas, Nick Aitken, MP for Cities of London and Westminster, entrepreneur Louis EU, and artist David Tovey, a campaigner for families, as well as children's advocate Anne Longfield. Do stay tuned, join us for the rest of the week, and remember to keep the conversation going using the hashtag ImpactForum 2021.